So again, as we consider historical written descriptions of technical applications, we're looking at Littlejohn again. Littlejohn is speaking essentially about the vertebrae in general, or a flexed vertebrae or a forward bent vertebrae. He speaks in both of the slides that you would have seen before that said pause to read. So if you haven't done that, you can go back, pause to read, and then come back to this point. You're getting descriptions of doing this on the side in the jackknife position, or doing this in prone, right? So on the side, he is using flexion of the limbs, of the lower limb, towards the abdomen, but he's essentially trying to create backwards bending or extension. So he's talking about using the hand as pressure against the spinous processes or against the vertebrae, and then essentially using like a shear type motion, or you're going to shear the leg back, or use the legs to shear the pelvis backwards to create essentially backward bending from the bottom off the leg. So even though it's going to be a flexion bias position, he's going to use the legs to push backwards against the relatively still vertebrae. So that is well described by a concept that I utilize called, or I use to describe things in the form of relational motion. One thing stays still, one thing moves in relation to it. So he talks about the patient's limbs against the practitioner's body, right? So that looks like this. And the reason for that is because I want to be able to push and lean into the legs to be able to create that motion. So I want to keep this still, right? So I'm palpating here. So this looks like flexion to most people, and if I went further up, it would look like flexion. That is considering where the legs are going and what they should do to the lumbar region. However, in Littlejohn's mind, if I'm holding here and I push my body into the patient's legs, so you'll have to kind of watch here to see some motion, he's going to consider that extension in a relative sense. So this is the jackknife position. You can use this for flexion, but for him, or to create flexion, he's talking about basically using the body contact through the femur as leverage to push the pelvis backwards against the fixed point, right? So that's that method. I'll have you on your stomach for a minute. The next method that he talks about is basically overpressure on the sacrum or overpressure on the vertebrae. So again, you're trying to create extension. He talks about either using the leg straight, so pulling the leg or legs straight back, or doing that with some circumduction or some rotatory motion. So he talks about where you're able to grab the leg above the knee or grab the legs above the knee. He gave both options there, and part of that's probably, although not described, considering the size of the practitioner versus the size of the patient or the weight of the leg in general. So one leg, right? So you're pushing down on the spinous processes. You're going to try to grab one leg and create extension with that leg. You're going to try to grab it above the knee. So I'll show some modifications there, but in a simple sense, you could just grab under the thigh and lift, right? So you can do that. Okay, so that's extension of the leg to create extension through the lumbar region with one leg. Above the knee, you've got your overpressure. I have seen this done this way, right? So my forearm is above the knee, then I'm bracing, right? So I just use my body. Now, because I'm hunched, I have less freedom of motion there. Another way to do this, to be able to grab above the knee, is to essentially shorten the length or shorten or to remove some of the distal weight to what I'm doing. I can do something like this, right? So I basically hook here, right? And I can use my forearm to hold on. So I'm holding above the knee now. I've got that extension of the limb, overpressure on the spinous processes. So that's one leg. With two legs, right? I can't grab and cup like this. My arm's not big enough, right? So I can't do it with my hand necessarily on the other side. But what I can do, right, whether the legs are straight or not, I can lift here. It's very unruly, right? So I'm going to let the leg straighten down, right? Just so you can see this. This is very unruly, right? So I have to really reach, get my whole forearm under there. I'm hunched again. I've got my overpressure. I can lift. Very unruly, right? A modification to that, should you want to do that, is just lift here, right? So you hook the feet. So now you're not grabbing above the knee, but you hook the feet, right? So you've got your straight back, right? If you don't want to lift, you just grab both feet, You create your overpressure, your short lever, your circumduction, right? You can also then modify that to something that looks like this, right? Using the hip to bind into the pelvis, to wiggle the pelvis under the relatively still vertebrae. So whether or not you're trying to create strict extension or create circumduction, all those holds will match in general, whether it be one leg or two legs, Littlejohn's description. And then also remembering the jackknife, these are all about relational motion. Holding the vertebrae still, moving the leg, or using the leg as leverage to move the leg and the pelvis in relation to the vertebrae you're holding still, trying to create primarily backward bending, at least in these descriptions.